The barn was already screaming when Caleb Ironhand ran toward it. Flame tore through the roof in long orange tongues licking at the black Montana sky, throwing sparks so high they looked like stars trying to climb back to heaven. Men stood in the yard with buckets in their hands and fear in their boots, shouting over one another while the horses shrieked inside. The winter wind drove the fire hard against the timber walls, and every breath tasted of smoke, pitch, and burning hay. "Leave it!" Caleb, someone shouted. "Roof's going!" But Caleb heard another sound under the roar. Not a horse, not timber splitting, a boy crying. He was 27 then, broad-shouldered, clear-faced, with girls at church socials still looking twice when he passed. He had a life ahead of him that had not yet learned sorrow. He had 2 good hands, a strong back, and a foolish belief that a man ought to run where he was needed. So he wrapped a wet grain sack around his head and went in. 11 years later, Cedar Hollow remembered the fire mostly by what it had done to his face. Not the boy he dragged out half-choked and alive. Not the 2 horses he cut loose before the beams came down. Not the way his coat caught flame as he stumbled through the door and fell smoking into the snow. They remembered the right side of his face, pale and ridged from jaw to temple. The ear pulled tight, the neck marked where fire had laid its hand and not taken it away. A town can need a man's hands and still teach him to hate his own face. By the autumn of 1889, Caleb Ironhand was 38 years old, and Cedar Hollow had spent 11 years proving that very thing. They came to his forge because they had to. They brought him bent wagon rims, cracked stove hinges, dull plow teeth, broken axe heads, horses needing shoes, chains needing links, and iron gates sagging from their posts. There was not a ranch within 40 miles that did not depend on something Caleb had shaped over his anvil. But needing a man is not the same as welcoming him. Men paid him with their eyes fixed on the counter. Women crossed the street with their market baskets and called it coincidence. Children peered through the fence slats, daring one another to look at the blacksmith's devil side, then scattered shrieking if Caleb turned his head. He stopped turning his head after a while. He worked before sunrise and after dusk because iron did not care what a man looked like. Iron answered only heat, hammer, patience, and strength. Caleb understood iron better than he understood people. A bar of iron could be made useful if a man brought it honestly to the fire. Folks were harder. Folks could bend crooked and call it righteousness. His forge stood at the north edge of Cedar Hollow, where the boardwalk thinned and the wagon road climbed toward the pine ridges. In the morning, smoke lifted from his chimney before any lamp showed in the mercantile. The sound of his hammer carried down the street steady as a church bell and lonelier than one. He kept his house clean, though no one came to sit in it. He swept the floor every Saturday evening. He folded his blankets square. He washed his cup and plate as if a guest might arrive and judge him by them. On the shelf above the stove sat a small mirror turned toward the wall. Dust had gathered on the back of it. He had not looked into it in years. That morning, frost silvered the hitching rails and the grass along the road. Caleb was shaping a hinge strap when old Mrs. Bellwether's little sled appeared beside the forge door. One runner snapped clean off. No one had brought it to him. Someone had left it in the dark, maybe ashamed to ask a kindness from a man they would not invite to Sunday supper. Caleb set down his hammer, studied the brake, and repaired it before breakfast. He made the runner stronger than it had been then, carried the sled to the mercantile porch while the town still slept. By the time Ruth Bellwether opened her sewing room, the sled was waiting there with no note and no charge. That was how Caleb gave to Cedar Hollow now, quietly, before witnesses could make either gratitude or embarrassment out of it. Near noon, Joseph Two Rivers came in with the freight wagon, his horses blowing steam into the cold. Joseph was Métis, dark-haired and lean, with a face cut by weather and eyes that had watched too many men decide where he did or did not belong. He hauled mail-flour coffee tools, hides and news between mission settlements, ranch houses, trading posts, and towns that called him useful when they needed translation and half-breed when they wanted someone beneath them. He was one of the few men who looked Caleb straight in the face. Morning Ironhand. Joseph called, swinging down from the wagon. "You still beating that anvil like it owes you money. It pays better than most men," Caleb said. Joseph laughed and led the team to water. He came back carrying a sack of coffee under one arm and a folded newspaper under the other. "Brought your order. Also brought foolishness from the east. Keep the foolishness. Can't. It was addressed to you." Caleb glanced up. Joseph's smile softened, though he tried to hide it under mischief. "You remember that notice you sent off last spring?" The hinge strap cooled too long in Caleb's tongs. Its glow faded from yellow to dull red. "I remember wishing I hadn't." Well, Joseph said, pulling an envelope from inside his coat somebody wished you had. Caleb stared at the letter as if it were a snake coiled in Joseph's palm. I don't know any woman that far east, he said. She ain't east exactly. Mission side of the Yellowstone country. Name's Winona Red Elk. The name entered the forge and changed the air. Caleb did not reach for the letter. His scar tightened in the cold as it always did when he was unsettled. What does she want? Joseph's eyes grew quieter. Maybe what you asked for. Caleb gave a rough breath that was almost a laugh. I asked for something no sensible woman would answer. Joseph leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. You asked plain. Some folks prefer plain. Caleb remembered every word of the notice because shame had carved it into him after he sent it. Blacksmith, Cedar Hollow, Montana Territory, 38 years of age, own home, steady trade, not a handsome man, and will not pretend otherwise. Burned in a fire years past and bear the marks plainly. Seek a wife who values quiet life and honest company, can offer respect, shelter, and faithful labor, cannot offer more, will not offer less. He had written it after a winter fever nearly took him alone in his bed. For 3 days he had burned and shivered with no hand on his forehead. No voice in the house, no one to know whether he woke or died. When spring came, loneliness had sat at his table like another man. So he wrote the notice and mailed it before pride could stop him. Then pride returned and punished him for months. Joseph placed the letter on the workbench. Read it or burn it, but don't let fear make the choice and call it wisdom. He went outside to check the horses. Caleb stood a long while before touching the envelope. The handwriting was firm, careful, not pretty for prettiness' sake. He opened it with fingers that could hold red iron steady but trembled over paper. Mr. Ironhand. Your notice did not flatter, and for that reason I believed it more than the others. My name is Winona Red Elk. I'm 34 years old, Lakota, and widowed. I'm a large woman, broad in body and not made small by wishing. Some have judged me for it. Others have judged me before that for my blood. I tell you these things first because you told your own truth first, and I will not begin with hiding. I can cook, sew, wash, mend, keep accounts, tend a stove, stretch flour through hard weather, and sit in silence without mistaking it for cruelty. I have no use for a man who wants an ornament. I have no wish to be any man's servant under the name of wife. If you meant what you wrote about respect, shelter, and faithful company, then I am willing to write again. I ask only this, do not lie to me, and do not make shame out of what God already made. Caleb read it once, then he read it again. Outside Cedar Hollow carried on with its small cruelties and smaller mercies. A wagon rattled past. A woman laughed outside the mercantile. Somewhere a child called another child a coward. The world did not know it had shifted. But inside the forge, Caleb stood with a letter in his scarred hands and felt something move in him that he had thought long dead. Not happiness. Not yet. Hope was a dangerous thing, and he had learned to treat dangerous things with respect. He folded the letter carefully and set it beside the coffee sack. Then he stepped to the forge door and looked down the empty road that ran beyond town, past the last fences, past the frozen grass toward the far country where a woman named Winona Red Elk had written his name without fear. Joseph came up beside him but said nothing for a while. At last Caleb asked, You know her? You. I know of her, Joseph said. Hard worker, proud but not foolish, been treated unkind by folks with less reason to stand tall than she has. Caleb swallowed. Why would she come here? Joseph looked down the road too. Maybe she's tired of places that already decided what she's worth. The wind lifted coal smoke from the chimney and carried it over Cedar Hollow. Caleb watched it drift across the town that needed him, feared him, and had long ago mistaken its own fear for truth. In the house behind him, the mirror still faced the wall. On the bench, the letter waited. And far beyond the ridge's wheels Caleb could not yet hear were beginning to turn toward him. By the time the stagecoach came down through the North Pass, half of Cedar Hollow had already decided what kind of woman would step out of it. A desperate one, some said. A foolish one, others added. A plain one, most agreed, because no woman with choices would ride across hard country to marry the scarred blacksmith who lived above the forge and spoke more kindly to iron than to men. The coach appeared first as a low dust cloud beyond the last bend of the road, its wheels striking frozen ruts with a hollow clatter. The afternoon was cold enough that breath showed white around the waiting horses tied outside the mercantile. A pale sun hung over the Montana ridges, giving light but little warmth, and the whole town seemed to lean toward the road, as if pulled by a single ugly curiosity. Caleb Ironhand heard the coach before he saw it. He stood inside the forge with a horseshoe cooling in the quench barrel, steam rising around his hands. For a moment he did not move. The hammer lay on the anvil. The fire breathed behind him. Every sound in Cedar Hollow seemed suddenly too sharp a door latch, a boot heel on boards, a woman's low whisper, the far-off jangle of harness. Joseph Two Rivers had told him she would likely arrive before sundown if the pass held clear. Caleb had told himself all morning that she might not come. Roads washed out, horses went lame, people changed their minds. A woman had a right to change her mind before binding her life to a man whose face made children cry. Then the stage horn sounded. His scar tightened along his jaw. He washed at the basin behind the forge until the water turned gray with coal dust. He had already changed into his clean shirt at noon, though smoke had found him again, as smoke always did. He scrubbed his hands, though black had settled deep in the cracks of his skin and under his nails. He ran wet fingers through his hair, then stopped when he caught the faint reflection of himself in the dark window glass. The right side of his face looked back like a thing poorly remembered by God. He turned away. Outside, the town was gathering. Men came out of the saloon and stood with their thumbs tucked in their belts. Mrs. Bellwether appeared in the doorway of her sewing room, spectacles low on her nose, a length of blue cloth forgotten in her hand. Two women from the church stood near the mercantile steps with baskets over their arms. Children moved in a restless pack near the hitching rail, hushing one another and then giggling because they could not help themselves. Caleb took his hat from its peg and stepped into the street. The coach rolled in, hard wheels grinding horses, blowing leather traces creaking from the long pole. Dust clung to the driver's coat and to the side lamps. A trunk was strapped to the rear plane and dark with a strip of red cloth tied around the handle. The driver climbed down and opened the coach door. For one breath, nobody spoke. Then Winona Red Elk stepped onto the boardwalk. She was not what Cedar Hollow had imagined. She was a large woman, broad through the hips and shoulders, full in the face, steady in the way she held herself after days of hard travel. Her dark wool dress had been brushed clean as best she could manage, but the hem carried road dust. A red shawl lay around her shoulders. Two black braids fell forward, and at her throat was a small piece of beadwork, red, white, and blue, bright against the plainness of her clothes. She set one gloved hand against the coach door and looked at the town. The silence changed. Caleb felt it happen. It had weight, that silence. He knew its shape from years of standing inside it. It was not simple surprise. It was judgment, deciding where to put its teeth. Someone outside the saloon gave a low laugh. Another man murmured something Caleb could not hear, and the men beside him grinned. One of the church women looked from Winona's face to her body, then to the beadwork at her throat, and pressed her lips together as if she had tasted something sour. Winona heard enough. Caleb saw that she heard. Her face did not change, but her shoulders settled in a way that told him she had been carrying that kind of silence long before she ever came to Cedar Hollow. The driver lowered her trunk. "This yours, ma'am?" "It is," she said. Her voice was calm, lower than Caleb had expected, warm but not soft. Joseph Two Rivers stood near the freight wagon across the street, watching with his arms folded. He gave Caleb a small nod, not encouragement exactly, but reminder. "Stand where you are. Do not let shame move you." Caleb stepped forward. The crowd parted for him in the way it always did, not out of respect but out of habit. He held his hat in both hands. He had thought about this moment through too many sleepless nights. He had imagined her flinching. He had imagined her looking once at his face, and then toward the driver, asking how far the coach could take her before dark. He had imagined pity, too, which somehow frightened him worse than disgust. He stopped a few feet from her. "Mrs. Red Elk," he said, and his voice came out rough from smoke and disuse. "I'm Caleb Ironhand." She turned fully toward him. There it was. The first look. People were never as clever as they thought. Even kind ones betrayed themselves in that first moment. Their eyes slid to the burned side, widened, then fled, or they forced themselves to stare too long, making a virtue out of not recoiling. Caleb had learned all the ways a face could be refused. Winona looked at him plainly. She looked at the smooth left side first, then the burned right side, then his eyes. She did not hurry. She did not soften her mouth into pity. She did not pretend there was nothing to see. And Caleb, who had been braced for her judgment, found himself seeing her too. He saw the tiredness around her eyes, the road dust on her dress, the proud lift of her chin. He saw the fullness of her body and the way the town wanted her to feel it as a failing. He saw strong hands inside worn gloves. He saw a woman who had arrived alone among strangers already sharpening their knives. She did not flinch from his scars, and he did not make shame out of her size. Something passed between them then, quiet as breath over banked coals. "Mr. Ironhand," she said, loud enough that the mercantile porch could hear, "I came because your letter told the truth. I have no use for a handsome lie." No one laughed after that. Caleb tried to answer, but for a moment there was no room in his chest for words. He had expected many things. He had not expected to be defended before he had even been welcomed. At last he said, "Your trunk can ride in my wagon. The house is up the rise near the forge." Winona looked towards the hill, then back at him. "Then I suppose we ought to go before your town wears itself thin staring." Joseph coughed into his fist, hiding a smile. The driver helped Caleb lift the trunk into the wagon. Caleb offered his hand to help Winona step down from the boardwalk. He did it slowly, leaving her room to refuse. She placed her gloved hand in his. Her grip was firm. Behind them, Cedar Hollow began to murmur again. But the sound had lost some of its pleasure. A crowd that had gathered to witness humiliation grows restless when dignity walks away from it. Ruth Bellwether watched from her doorway, still holding the blue cloth. She had meant to see foolishness. Instead, she had seen a woman stand under the whole town's gaze and not bow her head. It unsettled Ruth more than she cared to admit. Caleb drove the wagon up the rise, the horse moving slow under the added weight of the trunk. Winona sat beside him with her hands folded over the red shawl. For a while, neither spoke. The town fell behind them, though Caleb could still feel it watching. The house came into view just above the forge. 2 rooms, plain board stone chimney woodpile stacked tight against the north wall. The forge stood below it, black-roofed and breathing smoke. "It isn't much," Caleb said, before he could stop himself. Winona looked at the swept porch, the clean window, the split wood, the mended gate. A man who says that much about a clean house either has too much pride or too little. He did not know whether to smile. Likely both. Inside the room was warm. Caleb had built the fire before going down to the road. A kettle sat near the stove. The floor was scrubbed. The table had been rubbed with oil until the old wood held a low shine. On it stood a canning jar filled with late wild asters, their purple heads drooping slightly from the heat. Winona stopped when she saw them. Caleb followed her gaze and wished suddenly he had not cut them. They looked foolish now, stuck in a jar like an apology with stems. "I didn't know what kind you might like," he said. Her gloved fingers touched one petal. "No one has brought me flowers in 9 years." He looked down at his hat. They were growing by the creek. Then they had a good beginning. The words settled softly in the little room. He showed her where he had put fresh linens where the flour was kept, which board near the stove creaked and how the latch stuck when the wind came from the north. He told her the bed was hers and that he had made space for himself in the lean-to off the forge. Winona turned to him. "Until I say otherwise," his face warmed, scar and all. "Yes, ma'am. Until you say otherwise." "Good," she said. "Then we understand one another." They were married that Sunday in the white church at the end of the street. The circuit preacher arrived late, smelling of horse and cold air. Joseph stood witness on Caleb's side. On Winona's side stood no family, but she wore her red shawl and the beadwork at her throat, and she stood as if absence itself could not bend her. Ruth Bellwether came and sat near the back with Annie beside her. Ruth told herself she had come because everyone would talk if she did not know the facts. But when Caleb's voice shook over the vows and Winona reached for his hand, without looking embarrassed by him, Ruth lowered her eyes to her lap. When the preacher asked if there were objections, the church held its breath. None came. Not because Cedar Hollow approved, because cowardice prefers corners and whispers to open air. In the weeks that followed, the house above the forge changed by inches. Winona hung curtains. She cooked thick stew with beans and salt pork. She patched Caleb's apron with stitches so even he studied them in admiration. She placed a small strip of beadwork along the edge of a shelf cloth, and the colors made the room seem less lonely without making it less his. Caleb learned the small sounds of her living there, her steps before dawn, the scrape of the coffee pot, the low humming when she mended the soft exhale she gave when sitting down after a long day. He found himself leaving the best piece of firewood near the stove, setting aside smooth-handled tools for her use, fixing the loose porch step before she mentioned it twice. He watched her sometimes when she was not looking. She always knew. One cold afternoon, while Winona was folding dry cloth near the hearth, a stone struck the forge wall below with a sharp crack. Caleb's hammer stopped. Children's voices scattered in laughter. One boy shouted "devil face," another called "Indian witch bride." Then boots slapped frozen dirt as they ran. Caleb stood still beside the anvil, his face unreadable. Winona came to the doorway. She saw him lower the hammer and turn back to his work as if nothing had happened. That hurt her worse than the words. At the edge of the fence, one child had not run. A small girl in a brown coat stood half hidden behind a post, staring not at Caleb's face but at the forge fire. Annie Bellwether. Caleb saw her too. He said nothing. That night after supper, the wind pressed cold against the walls. Caleb sat near the stove, pretending to study a seed catalog Joseph had left behind. Winona mended one of his shirts by lamplight. At last she said, "Children repeat what fills the rooms they sleep in." Caleb did not look up. "They're children. They are," she said, which means somebody older gave them those words first. His jaw moved once, but he made no answer. Winona drew the thread through cloth slow and clean. Then one day an adult ought to give them better words. Caleb looked toward the dark window. For years he had let silence stand where defense should have been. Silence had kept him alive, or so he had believed. But now there was another person in the house, and every stone thrown at him struck nearer to her than he could bear. Outside, the forge fire had burned low, but not out. At dawn, while frost still clung to the fence rails, Annie Bellwether came back alone. She stood at the edge of the yard with both hands tucked into her sleeves, watching the forge breathe red light into the morning. Caleb saw her from the doorway. This time he did not turn away. Annie Bellwether came back to the forge every morning for 6 days before Caleb spoke to her. She stood at the fence in the blue, cold, small boots planted in frost-chin, tucked into her brown coat, watching the bellows swell and fall like the chest of some sleeping beast. She did not call out. She did not throw stones. She did not whisper devil-face the way the boys had. She only watched the fire change colors. Watched Caleb lift iron from the coals, watched the hard black bar turn red, then orange, then almost white beneath his hand. On the 7th morning, Caleb took a scrap of iron no longer than his thumb and laid it in the heat. Annie's eyes widened. He said nothing while he worked. He flattened one end, bent the other, drew out 4 little legs with delicate taps that seemed impossible from hands so large. The hammer that could shape wagon rims now moved soft as a spoon against a teacup. When he quenched the piece, steam rose between them. He set the cooled iron on the top rail of the fence. Annie stepped close. It was a buffalo. Small, rough, strong-backed, its head lowered as if walking into weather. "For me?" she asked. Caleb nodded once. She picked it up with both hands, though it weighed almost nothing. "Grandma says buffalo are gone from most places." Caleb glanced toward the house where Winona stood in the doorway with a shawl around her shoulders. Some things folks call gone are only waiting somewhere they can still breathe. Annie looked at the burned side of his face, not rudely, not fearfully, but with the open study of a child who had not yet learned which truths adults preferred hidden. "Did the fire hurt?" she asked. Caleb's fingers tightened around the tongs. Annie Winona said gently, but Caleb answered, "Yes." Annie looked down at the buffalo. "I'm sorry it did." That was all. No sermon, no pity, no fear. She tucked the little iron animal into her coat pocket and smiled at him as if he had given her a piece of the sun. After that, she came often. Ruth Bellwether scolded, then warned, then finally gave up when she found Annie sitting on an overturned nail keg outside the forge, listening while Caleb explained how the bellows fed air to the coals. Ruth stood stiff at the road lips pressed thin, but Annie only waved. Winona watched it all with a quiet ache in her chest. At night, while Caleb banked the fire and washed the black from his hands, she said, "Children see the person before they learn the rumor." Caleb dried his hands slowly. "Most learn quick, then it matters who teaches them." He looked toward the shelf where Annie had left a smear of ash from curious fingers. "She ain't scared." "No," Winona said. "She is not." The words should have comforted him. Instead, they unsettled him. Hatred was simple. Caleb knew where to put hatred. He had carried it on other people's faces for 11 years. But trust from a child was a fragile thing, and he feared his scar might still find some way to ruin it. Winter deepened over Cedar Hollow. Snow crowded the boardwalks and hardened in the wagon ruts. The forge became the warmest place in town, and men who would not have invited Caleb to supper stood near his fire with their palms out, waiting for repaired hinges, sharpened axes, new runners for sledges, iron bands for wheels, hooks for smokehouses, and nails by the pound. Winona learned the season's arithmetic. Flour had to last. Beans had to stretch. Salt pork could not be wasted. Coffee was measured with care. She dried herbs near the stove, patched Caleb's socks, traded beadwork for lamp oil, and kept the little house above the forge smelling of stew, coal smoke, and clean cloth. Yes. She didn't make the house pretty in the way Cedar Hollow women understood pretty. She made it alive. A strip of beadwork brightened the shelf cloth. A braided rawhide loop held the kettle rag. A blue and red pattern edged the curtain by the stove. Her hands left memory in small places. Caleb noticed each one. He noticed more than that. He noticed when she came back from town quieter than she had gone. He noticed when she kneaded bread too hard, folding the dough with a force that made the table creak. He noticed the way she unpinned her shawl and laid it down carefully, as if one careless motion might let loose something she meant to keep contained. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing worth carrying into this house. That ain't the same as nothing." She kept working the dough. For a moment he thought she would not answer. At Mrs. Bellwether's, she said at last, "Two women were wondering how much cloth it takes to cover me." Caleb went still. They laughed. Winona continued. Her voice remained even, but the hurt beneath it had edges. "One said you must have needed a freight team just to bring your bride home." The room changed around him. The stove ticked. Wind touched the window. Caleb felt anger rise in him, slow and black. But beneath it came something worse, shame old and familiar, whispering that he had brought her here to be wounded by people who had already wounded him. Who, he asked. Winona looked at him then. "Do not go breaking your hands on fools. They had no right." "No," she said. "They did not. Ruth, hear it." Winona turned back to the dough. She heard. She folded cloth. Caleb said nothing because silence had always been his poorest habit and his easiest refuge. That evening he went to the forge and worked long after dark. When Winona woke before dawn, she found a new iron hook fixed beside the stove, strong and smooth, placed exactly where she had once said a pot hook ought to be. Caleb never mentioned it. Neither did she. But when he came in for coffee, she touched the hook once with her fingertips, and he saw that she understood the apology he did not know how to speak. The storm came 3 days later, driving hard from the north. By noon, the street was half snow, half mud, and by mid-afternoon, Silas Crowder rode into Cedar Hollow with 2 ranch hands behind him and anger sitting high in his saddle. Crowder owned the largest spread in the valley and owed half the town money in one form or another. He was a broad man with a silver watch chain, a trimmed beard, and the kind of voice that expected smaller voices to make room for it. He came to the forge carrying a bill Caleb had written, fair and exact. "You're charging me twice now because you got a wife to feed," Silas said loud enough for men near the mercantile to hear. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. "I'm charging for iron labor and time. You took too long. Your wagon came in split at the axle and near ruined at both rims." Silas stepped closer. "I said you took too long." Caleb folded the rag once and set it aside. "Bill stands." A few men drifted nearer, hungry for conflict because winter left little else to watch. Ruth Bellwether appeared in her sewing room doorway. Annie slipped beside her, one hand deep in her coat pocket closed around the little iron buffalo. Joseph Two Rivers stood near his freight wagon unloading sacks of flour, but his eyes had fixed on the forge. Silas smiled then, and it was worse than anger. "Should have known better than to deal square with a marked man," he said. "My old mother used to say fire shows what God already saw, burns wickedness right up where decent folks can read it." The street quieted. Caleb did not move, but Winona, standing in the house doorway above the forge, heard every word. Silas turned his head toward her. "And look what kind of woman answers such a man. A fat Indian widow with no prospects and a trunk full of colored beads. I suppose even a ruined blacksmith can look like a husband if a woman's hungry enough." Joseph dropped the flour sack. Winona walked down the porch steps. Caleb's voice came low. "Winona, don't." She did not stop. Snow blew across the street in thin white sheets. Winona crossed through it with her shawl tight around her shoulders and stood between Silas Crowder and her husband. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You speak much for a man who owes money," she said. Silas laughed. "This ain't your matter. My husband is my matter." The word struck Caleb harder than any insult had. Joseph stepped forward. "Crowder, you best leave this." But Silas had already chosen pride over sense. "I say what all can see." Fire marked him. "God don't scar a man like that for nothing." Joseph's face hardened. "That barn wasn't his. You know that some men shifted." Joseph looked around at them. 11 years ago, Caleb Ironhand ran into Daniel Price's burning barn because a stable boy was trapped in the loft and the horses were screaming. Roof was coming down. Men stood right where they were holding buckets like prayers they were too scared to use. Caleb went in. Boy came out alive. Horses, too. Caleb came out burning. The wind moved through the silent street. Winona looked at Silas, and all the hurt she had swallowed in sewing rooms, on boardwalks, in church corners, and under strangers' eyes, settled into something clean and sharp. You call that mark a curse because you were never brave enough to earn one. No one breathed. She stepped closer. That scar is not wickedness. It is proof. Proof that when fire opened its mouth, Caleb Ironhand walked toward it while other men watched. You have mistaken courage for ugliness because it is easier than admitting what your own face would have shown that night. Silas's jaw clenched. Winona's voice remained steady. And you will not speak shame over my body, my blood, or my marriage to hide the fact that you came here hoping to cheat an honest man. Ruth Bellwether moved then, one step onto the boardwalk, then another. Pay him, Silas, Ruth said. Silas turned on her. Stay out of it, widow. Ruth's face trembled, but she did not retreat. No, I have stayed out of enough. Annie stepped beside her grandmother, clutching the iron buffalo. Joseph came to stand near Winona. Then one of the men by the mercantile muttered Bill's fair Silas. Another nodded. Silas Crowder looked around and saw the pleasure had gone out of the crowd. What remained was judgment, and for the first time it was pointed at him. He threw the money down on Caleb's workbench, coins scattered across the wood. There he said, "Take it." Caleb did not touch the money until Silas had mounted and ridden away, his ranch hands following through the blowing snow. That night the house was quiet. Caleb sat at the table, the lamplight catching the burned ridges of his face. He had not eaten much. Winona cleared the plates and set coffee before him. You should not have had to stand in the street for me, he said. Winona sat across from him. No, his eyes lifted. I did not stand there for you alone, she said. I stood there for every part of us they thought they had permission to shame. Something in Caleb's face broke not into weakness but into pain, finally allowed to breathe. He reached across the table. Slowly, as if the right to touch her still had to be earned, Winona placed her hand in his broad palm to scarred knuckles, warmth to warmth. Outside, snow softened the roofs of Cedar Hollow and covered the track Silas Crowder's horse had left in the street. By morning, the storm had passed. When Winona opened the door, Ruth Bellwether stood on the porch, holding a folded length of cloth, a small sack of coffee, and an apology that had not yet found its way to her mouth. Ruth Bellwether stood on Winona's porch with her hands full and her courage arriving late. The morning after the storm was white and still. Snow lay thick over the forge roof, over the woodpile, over the wagon tracks that had cut through Cedar Hollow the day before. The whole town looked softened, as if God had covered its ugliness for a few hours and given it a chance to decide what it might become when the thaw came. Ruth held a folded length of blue wool over one arm and a small sack of coffee against her chest. Her bonnet was tied crooked beneath her chin. She had walked up the rise before the smoke had fully risen from Caleb's chimney, and now that she stood before Winona, she seemed to have forgotten every word she had practiced on the way. Winona opened the door and looked at her. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Ruth's eyes moved past Winona into the warm room where the stove glowed and Caleb's heavy coat hung beside Winona's red shawl. Her gaze stopped at the iron hook Caleb had fixed near the stove, then at the beadwork along the shelf cloth, then at Winona's face. I brought coffee, Ruth said. Winona waited. And cloth, Ruth added, lifting the wool a little. It was left from an order. Too fine to sit in my room gathering dust. That is kind, Winona said. Ruth swallowed. Snow clung to the hem of her skirt. No, it ain't. Not yet. Winona's hand stayed on the door. Ruth looked down at the coffee sack. I heard them women speak about you in my shop. I heard every word. I folded cloth and pretended my silence was not agreement. Her mouth tightened as if the truth had a bitter taste. But silence can sit at the same table as cruelty and eat just as well. The little house was quiet behind Winona. From the forge below came the first low stir of Caleb rebuilding the fire. Winona studied Ruth a long moment. She saw the shame in the older woman's face, but also the effort. It would have been easy to make Ruth stand there and suffer. Some part of Winona, tired from years of swallowed insult, wanted to. But another part knew that if people were never allowed to step toward better ground, they would stay forever where they had done wrong. Come in, Winona said. Ruth's breath left her all at once. They drank coffee at the table while dawn came gray over the ridges. Ruth unfolded the blue wool and spread it across the boards. The cloth was deep as twilight, sturdy enough for winter, pretty enough for Sunday. It would make a good dress, Ruth said. Winona touched the edge. It would take more cloth than some women think decent. Ruth flinched, then gave a small nod. Then some women have mean little minds. Winona looked at her, and the corner of her mouth softened. Mean minds can learn if they are willing to be embarrassed first. That was the beginning. Spring did not come quickly to Cedar Hollow. It loosened the world one stubborn inch at a time. Snow withdrew from the wagon ruts and left mud in its place. The creek broke open under its skin of ice. Brown grass showed along the south-facing hills. The forge doors stood open again, and Caleb's hammer rang out into air that smelled of wet earth, coal smoke, and thawing pine. The town changed the same way. Slowly, unevenly, without admitting at first that it was changing. Men who once brought Caleb work and stared at his boots began saying his name when they paid. A ranch hand who had laughed outside the saloon in autumn tipped his hat one morning and looked ashamed afterward, as if respect were a new coat that did not yet fit. The mercantile owner stopped sending his boy up with messages and came himself. Women came to Winona with sewing questions, recipes, garden cuttings. Some came because Ruth came. Some came because guilt is a heavy bucket, and folks will carry it only so long before looking for a place to set it down. Winona accepted what was offered, but she did not pretend not to remember. Joseph Two Rivers rode in twice before the roads fully dried. The first time he brought flour and letters. The second time he brought news from ranch country and leaned in the forge doorway while Caleb shaped a gate hinge. "They tell it different now," Joseph said. Caleb did not look up. "Tell what? The fire." Caleb struck the hinge once, twice, 3 times. "Folks tell what suits them." Joseph smiled without humor. "True, but now it suits them to say you ran into Daniel Price's barn when better-dressed men stood outside praying with dry sleeves." Caleb turned the iron. "I did what was in front of me. That is what brave men usually call it. I wasn't brave. I was young. You were both." Joseph crossed his arms. "Do not trust a town's conscience too quickly, but do not refuse it when it finally crawls to your door. Some folks need shame before they find decency." Caleb set the hinge aside. Praise sat strangely in him. Insult he understood. Suspicion he could carry. Admiration felt like a tool made for another man's hand. Annie Bellwether kept coming to the forge. The little iron buffalo lived in her coat pocket, then in her apron pocket when the weather warmed. She showed it to other children and told them the truth with the simple authority of the young. "Mr. Ironhand got burned saving a boy," she said one afternoon near the mercantile steps. "And horses. My grandmother says folks ought to remember that before they open their mouths." Ruth, standing nearby with a basket on her arm, closed her eyes briefly but did not correct her. Children listened better to Annie than they ever had to sermons. By May, fewer dared one another to look through the forge fence. A few came openly to watch. Caleb pretended not to notice until one small boy asked how fire made iron soft, and Caleb, after a long pause, answered. Yet the deepest winter in Caleb had not gone out. Winona saw it in lamplight. He still turned the burned side of his face away when sitting near her. He still stepped back too quickly if their shoulders touched in the kitchen. He still watched her sometimes with a fear so old it had become habit, as if every peaceful evening were a borrowed thing that might be reclaimed by morning. She waited because some wounds cannot be pulled open before they are ready to drain. One evening in late May, the lilacs near Ruth's fence had opened and their sweetness drifted up the rise on the warm air. The sun was sinking behind the ridges, laying gold along the street, the forge, the water trough, the windows of the little house. Caleb stood in the forge doorway with his apron hanging loose and his hands washed clean as they ever got. Winona came down from the house and stood beside him. For a while they watched the valley without speaking. Cedar Hollow was settling into evening. A wagon creaked near the livery. Somewhere a woman called a child in for supper. The forge fire banked low, breathed red behind them. "I have been trying to say a thing," Caleb said. Winona waited. For weeks, maybe. He gave a dry, helpless breath. Longer than that. The scarred side of his face caught the last light. He didn't turn it away this time, though she could see what it cost him. "When I wrote that notice, I expected nothing," he said. "When Joseph brought your letter, I told myself you would change your mind. When you stepped down from that stage, I thought you would look once and ask the driver to keep your trunk aboard. I did not." "No." His voice roughened. "And every day since I have wondered when you would regret that you didn't. A man learns to want less, Winona. He learns it like scripture if folks read it to him often enough. Want less and wanting cannot shame you. Want less and losing cannot kill you." Winona turned toward him. He looked at her then fully. But I want this house with you in it. I want your shawl by my coat. I want your coffee on the stove. I want your humming in the morning and your scolding when I leave ashes on the floor. I want your hand at my table." His jaw tightened, and wanting that much frightens me worse than fire ever did. Winona stepped closer. She lifted her hand slowly enough that he could move away if he needed. He did not. Her palm came to rest against the burned side of his face. Caleb closed his eyes. The scar beneath her hand was uneven, hard in places, tender in others. It was not beautiful in the way foolish people use the word. It was human. It was history. It was pain survived. "The only thing wrong with you was that you believed the people who could not see you," she said. His breath shook. "I did not come here because I had no choice," she continued. "I came because your letter sounded like a man who would rather be lonely than dishonest. I trusted that more than a smooth face. And you have loved me in every way you knew how. In warm rooms, in mended steps, in coffee left ready, in a hook by the stove, in a hand that never made me feel ashamed of the space I take in this world." He opened his eyes. They were wet, though no tears fell. "I love you," he said. The words came rough, late, and plain. They were all the finer for it. Winona smiled. "I know." He bent his head until his scarred cheek rested against her hair. They stood that way in the forge doorway while evening settled around them, and for once Caleb did not feel the town at his back. He felt only her hand against him, steady as earth. Years later, Cedar Hollow would tell the story differently. Some would swear they had always known Caleb Ironhand was a brave man. Some would say Winona Red Elk had been welcomed from the first day. Winona let them say it. Grace, she had learned, was sometimes the art of allowing people to become better without dragging their worst selves forever behind them. Ruth Bellwether became her friend in the ordinary way. Friendship often comes to women through thread coffee recipes, shared weather, and things confessed while hands are busy. Joseph Two Rivers always had a chair at their table and a place for his horses near the trough. Annie grew tall, but she never lost the little iron buffalo. At her wedding, she carried it sewn inside a pocket near her heart. When her first son was born, she named him Caleb Joseph, and no one had to ask why. The forge kept ringing, wagons kept breaking, winters kept coming. The scar did not leave Caleb's face, and Winona did not grow small to please anyone's eye. They simply lived, which was its own kind of answer. On summer evenings, when the heat went out of the day and the valley turned long and gold, Caleb and Winona sat together on the porch of the small house above the forge. His scarred hand wrapped around her broad, warm one. Below them lay Cedar Hollow, the town that had once gathered to see whether shame would win. It had been wrong, not quickly, not cleanly, but wrong all the same. And in the quiet, with lilacs fading and forge smoke rising thin into the evening sky, Caleb held his wife's hand as if it were the first honest thing the world had ever given him, and Winona held his back as if she had crossed every hard mile for exactly that.